Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Policy Forum series on unilateralization of EU trade policies, asserting interest or deserting principles. My name is Kateryna Holzer. I am from the University of Eastern Finland, and together with Professor Ferdi Ville from Ghent University, we'll be your moderators today. This event is organized by the 3E Research Center of the Brussels School of Governance, the Ghent Institute for International and European Studies, and the Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law of the University of Eastern Finland. From the outset, I would like to gratefully acknowledge the funding provided for the organization of this event by the European Commission's Erasmus Plus program as part of the Jean Monnet Chia equivalence. As you probably know, if you follow our events, we hold our Policy Forum sessions every 2 weeks. And this is the third event in this series. At our first session in September, we discussed the increasing assertiveness in EU trade policy. And we discussed also whether it can be interpreted as a shift towards unilateralism. At our second session, just 2 weeks ago, we were dealing with EU legislative initiatives aimed at leveling playing field at EU internal and external markets. And in 2 weeks, on the 10th of November, we'll be talking about geopolitics. But today's event is about sustainability, a key political priority of the EU. And today's session is dedicated to 3 EU trade-related sustainability initiatives. We will discuss legislative proposals on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, the proposal for a regulation on deforestation-free products, and the proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. These EU legislative proposals are attracting considerable attention both within and outside the EU. They raise debate among different stakeholders and also concerns of EU trade partners. And many commentators believe that these proposed measures are not only an expression of the new EU trade policy approach of strategic autonomy, but they also have the objective of leveraging the EU economic power in spheres which go beyond trade, and particularly affecting the environmental policy and human rights in other jurisdictions. And as such, these measures are measures with extraterritorial effects. And so today, we are going to discuss not only the rationales, main design features and functioning of these measures, but also potential consequences of these measures for third countries. And for this discussion, we are lucky to have 4 excellent speakers with us today. And I have a great pleasure to introduce them to you. Sandra Bartelt, Deputy Head of Cabinet of the EU Commissioner for International Partnerships, Urpilainen. Mohamed Shahim, a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Social Democrats. I should also mention that Dr. Shahim is the Parliament's rapporteur on the legislative proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And we are also very glad to have with us Ambassador Pedro Miguel Costa Silva, Head of the Mission of Brazil to the EU, and Ambassador Mehmet Kemal Bozay, the permanent representative of Türkiye to the EU. Many thanks for joining us. So Ferdi, let's start.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction, Kateryna. So I will take over here to moderate the first part of the debates and will later hand back to you to moderate the Q&A with the audience. So dear listeners, if you have any questions for the speakers during the debates, please put them in the Q&A box, and then Kateryna will select some of your questions and will put them to the speakers in the final part of our session. Now, we will now start with an introduction to the three instruments that Kateryna already mentioned by Ms. Bartelt. And this will then be followed by a first round of responses by the two ambassadors and MEP Chahim. This will then be followed by about half an hour of moderated debate before we finally go to questions from the audience. So without further ado, Ms. Bartelt, I would like to give you the floor to introduce the three instruments in about 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. And dear listeners, dear ambassadors, so I'm very happy to participate today in this panel discussion. And I want to congratulate you for this very interesting topic and timely topic that you have chosen. So I'm looking forward to the debate today. I have the honor to introduce the three legislative measures. And I would just underline, while I think at the beginning, in the preceding sessions, that was really more a stronger focus on trade, whereas what we have in front of us today is our core parts of our Green Deal in the Commission. And I would also like to underline that these three legislative measures are not yet adopted. So we are looking at a moving target. So they are still in the process. And I'm introducing them from the perspective of the Commission's proposal. But just to underline, it's not yet adopted by the co-legislators. And before I start with the introduction or the presentation of these three measures, I would like to make two preliminary remarks, also with a focus on the topic of your panel series. So one is in relation to multilateralism, and I want to put that right from the outset into the discussion that the EU is a firm supporter of multilateralism. So multilateralism is a strategic interest of the EU, and it is really part of our DNA. So if we to discuss today whether the measures are unilateralist or not, let me directly say they are not unilateralists. On the contrary, they are firmly embedded in international standards, and we also assess their impact on partner countries in line with the principle of policy coherence for development. So I want to make the distinction between unilateralist measures and autonomous measures that allow the EU to be a front runner and standard setter, but being perfectly in tune with WTO rules and other international norms. So that is my first comment that I would like to put also in the discussion for the other discussions afterwards. And my second comment is also on the Green Deal. So this is the EU's blueprint to ensure Europe's transformation towards sustainability. It's now very important. We are in front of COP27, and more we are looking at the dramatic consequences. So we have put forward this whole package of proposals under the Green Deal and also policy framework, like the 2030 biodiversity strategy or the farm to fork strategy. And they are supposed to reverse biodiversity loss, tackle climate change, and achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, because this is very closely linked to an international agenda. And now we, of course, have the internal dimension of the Green Deal, but it also has an external dimension. And in this external dimension, we will discuss further what will be the impact on partner countries. And I would say it is also in the sense of creating a level playing field. But we will see that more in detail in my presentation. But I would also like to underline that the EU also supports partner countries in measures that should help them or support them in embarking into this transition. So, and now I would like to turn to the different measures. I would start with the deforestation regulation. And here, this is part of a broader package of measures to tackle deforestation and forest degradation that was first outlined already in 2019 in a Commission communication on stepping up the EU action to protect and restore the world forests. So this is an increasing deforestation is increasing at an alarming rate, and thereby aggravating climate change and the loss of biodiversity. So then I would also like to underline that in Glasgow in 2021, that leaders pledged to halt deforestation by 2030 in their declaration on forests and land use. So the objective is to curb deforestation and forest degradation that is provoked by EU consumption and production. So it aims at minimizing the consumption of certain products that are coming from supply chains associated with deforestation. So, and this will in turn contribute to reducing the emissions of greenhouse gas, increasing climate change resilience, and reducing the biodiversity loss. So the draft regulation only allows the placing or making available on the union market or exporting from the union market. So this is important. There is no discrimination. It is really placing on the market or exporting. It does not only target producers from other countries. So, and these concern relevant commodities. And in the original Commission proposal, these were actually 6 commodities. And this is cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, and wood. And on this, there was also an impact assessment conducted. So, and now the operator has the obligation to issue a due diligence statement before exporting or placing products on the market. So it has to show that the risk of non-compliance is negligible. So, and if the product is stemming from outside the union, it is the first operator registered in the EU that has to ensure these due diligence requirements. So there are no stricter due diligence requirements for high-risk countries under the benchmarking system that is coming along with this draft regulation. So no operator will be discriminated. The difference is rather in the number of checks that the customs authorities of member states have to conduct. The benchmarking is therefore not supposed to blame, but it is supposed to incentivize countries to ensure stronger forest protection. And in this, we stand ready to cooperate with those partner countries via our delegations and other accompanying measures. It's important to note that there is no product ban associated from it. Products from even high-risk countries can still be placed on the EU market if the operator can bring this due diligence statement. And the EU member states are supposed to implement this regulation, and they can also impose fines on operators that are infringing the prohibition set out in the regulation. So this is a bit the deforestation regulation with focus on specific products. And I would now like to turn to the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, which is also, important part is on due diligence. But here the difference is maybe that while in the deforestation regulation, the objective is to limit the placing of deforestation-linked products on the EU market or to export them, the Sustainable Due Diligence Directive has rather a horizontal approach with a due diligence obligation addressing adverse human rights and environmental impacts that apply to a range of EU companies and non-EU companies along the supply chain. So it does not target specific commodities. And this directive fits into the overall agenda of transforming the EU economy towards greater sustainability. So it seeks to transpose, also here we have, it is grounded in international principles. So for instance, we have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, or the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. So, and it's also important to note that these rules are not the first of its kind, because prior to the Commission taking legislative action, we already had a couple of member states that were introducing these kind of rules. And in order to avoid fragmentation in the single market, we were coming forward with this proposal. And the main idea is that the directive would help to improve corporate governance practice to better integrate human rights and environmental risks in companies' processes. In such a way, the companies can develop their business strategies that would involve a risk assessment and looking at global value chains. So it's important also to say that, like the deforestation regulation, it does not, in the deforestation regulation, you don't have a ban on products. And here in the due diligence directive, is also not an obligation of final result, but there is a risk assessment that has to be conducted. And in order to mitigate and to minimize the associated adverse risks and impacts. So the goal of the proposal was not to make European companies abandon their activities in those value chains that represented high human rights and environmental risks. So that's really not the purpose. It's rather to act in complementarity with the EU's trade and development policy instruments to improve the living and working conditions in the affected third countries as well. So disengaging from harmful business relationships would rather stay as a last resort solution. It is more due diligence duty covering the whole value chain, but also taking into account that not all companies have the same influence on their value chain. So, I mean, the further you go down, of course, you cannot control everything in your value chain, and this is also taken into account. When it comes to enforcement, there is a combination of measures. We have a complaints mechanism and administrative supervision and also civil liability. Civil liability was necessary to ensure effective remedy to victims, with the conditions for its triggering being clearly defined. So this is on the due diligence directive, and now I would turn to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM regulation. So it's we're again at the core of the EU's Green Deal, and the target there is to have a 55% reduction in the carbon emissions compared to 1990 levels by 2030, and to become climate neutral by 2050 in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So, and the aim of the CBAM proposal is to ensure that reinforced EU internal decarbonization efforts do not engender counterproductive effects at the global level. As the EU raises its own climate ambition, there's a strong risk of so-called carbon leakage, which can shift emissions outside the EU to non-EU countries where less stringent environmental and climate policies prevail. So carbon leakage occurs when industries transfer polluting production to other countries with less stringent climate policies, or when EU products are replaced by more carbon-intensive imports. So, and this is where the CBAM comes in. It's a system to put a fair price on the carbon emitted during production, and that encourages a cleaner industry in non-EU countries. It will mirror the emissions trading system in the sense that the system is based on the purchase of CBAM certificates by importers. And this means there will be a CBAM register managed by national authorities where the importers can buy CBAM certificates, and the price of these certificates is calculated depending on the weekly average auction price of the EU ETS allowances. So, but if they can prove that a carbon price has already been paid during the production, this will then be deduced from their final bill. So, and there is also a limitation in scope in the Commission's proposal. In this first phase, the CBAM will focus on goods that are most at risk of carbon leakage, and these are, in our proposal, cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizer, and electricity. So it should be seen as a necessary element of the toolbox designed to ensure the environmental integrity and effectiveness of the EU's climate action. And it's designed to be in full compliance with WTO rules. I will not further comment on that now because I think this will be discussing in detail in our discussion on afterwards. And with this, I would then end my introductory explanations. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ms. Bartelt, for the very clear overview of these three instruments. Certainly not easy in 15 minutes, but you managed perfectly, I think. I would now like to invite Ambassador Costa e Silva to give us the view of Brazil on these instruments. And I assume you might primarily talk about the deforestation regulation, which is probably the file that is most consequential for your country. So, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists, and good afternoon to everyone who's listening in and watching this event. I also want to congratulate you, the organizers, on the choice of the title for this series, because I think that, and here I will start to respectfully disagree with my colleague from the EU, Ms. Bartelt. I think that we need to call things by their name. You can call a giraffe an elephant as many times as you want, it will still be a giraffe. And in this case, in the view of Brazil, we're looking at measures that are unilateral. They are, in some cases, extraterritorial. They are of a punitive nature based on sanctions. And here I would also make reference to another of legislation that is being drafted here in the EU, which is the anti-coercion legislation. And it's curious because in my view, these measures of the EU directed at countries such as Brazil are exactly that, coercive economic measures that want to implement other types of agendas. So several layers of problems with this kind of legislation, because we have, as was mentioned by Ms. Bartelt, international agreements and international fora where we deal with several of these issues. We can talk about climate change, we can talk about forests, we can talk about biodiversity, all these issues. We have specific fora where we are negotiating, where we have been negotiating, where we have agreed rules. And I can add other fora, such as she mentioned the WTO. So we have all these international fora and all these agreements that we have been negotiating sometimes for decades. And now we have this idea that one partner can have its own legislation to enforce these agreements with another layer of, let's say, pressure. And do that, and here I'll be diplomatic, autonomous by itself. So it is complicated. And when you talk about multilateralism, multilateralism is when you apply the rules that we all agreed to. The moment that you start acting by yourself, it's not multilateralism any longer. And that applies to across the board to all issues. So there, for me, there is a basic issue of coherence here. And being a diplomat, having worked in many of these areas for over 30 years, it is complicated to accept the idea that these are measures that are not unilateral, they are autonomous, and they are completely in line with all international commitments. In our view, they are not. And I will, since my first comments will be very brief, the impact, the possible impact of all of this. There is if you want, a reputational issue at first hand here, because if you have this legislation coming into effect and it will impact countries, why would a European importer want to import from country A or B if that country is deemed high risk or medium risk? Why not buy from somewhere else? So there are trade disincentives here, and it can generate a trade embargo. Apart from that, the extraterritorial element here, in the case of Brazil and deforestation legislation, we have one of the most stringent forest laws and agricultural laws in the world in terms of forest coverage. But we distinguish between legal and illegal deforestation. And I don't have time to get into why we do this, but it's a fact. That's our legislation. And the EU legislation does not distinguish. It's clearly stated that zero deforestation. So there is a clear element in which the specificity of a country is not taken into consideration. In the case of Brazil, must be replicated by other countries. Of course, this will generate enormous costs for those producers that want to export, and not all of these producers, contrary to maybe the perception here in Europe, are big producers. Brazil has many small producers, cooperatives that produce some of these products, and they certainly will be affected. And the question that I leave here for all of you is, how effective will this really be? Will this really diminish deforestation? I think that the best way to tackle the very important and central issue of deforestation, here I want to state clearly that we need to do more. Brazil has more homework to do, and I'm not in any way diminishing the issue of the importance of deforestation. But the way to go is cooperation, both technical and financial, dialogue, working together. That's the way that I think would be preferable to go forward, and not the adoption of trade-linked measures. I think that those are basically the initial comments that I wanted to make, but I will leave a last one, which is reading again this morning the draft, and I take the point that it's a draft. I have full respect for the people who will have to implement this, because it will be a real bureaucratic nightmare trying to geolocate where it was produced, identify grain by grain of soy, where it comes from, and whether, and if depending on the product, what the animal ate and where it came from. So the layers of complexity and the elements of proof are really mind-boggling. So it's another layer of complexity there, but I hope that at the end of the day, whatever comes out of the internal negotiations of the EU, it will be a more balanced and reasonable text, even though we won't like whatever comes out, and that it will be implemented also in a very reasonable and realistic way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Costa, for a very clear and very outspoken response. Really appreciate it. Of course, Ms. Bartelt will have the opportunity to respond to some of your points later. First, Ambassador Bozay will give us the perspective of Türkiye. And of course, Türkiye is a particularly interesting country in these discussions that we are having, as one of the countries that could be affected most significantly by CBAM, and at the same time sharing a customs union with the EU, which comes with certain obligations, but also certain opportunities for policy alignments. And by the way, there was a meeting of the Customs Union Joint Committee earlier today. So, Ambassador Bozay, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, distinguished professor. I salute all the participants, and I would like to thank you for arranging this timely panel and inviting us to share our views. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to address you today. I will make two comments, before starting with my main explanations, as you also briefly touched upon. Türkiye-EU trade relations have a specific character because we are the only candidate country with the customs union, and whatever happens has a significant impact on us. First of all, we should find all politics, including, political issues, and also all kind of, economic arrangements. EU's trade policies and legislation introduced in this regard are very important for both the global trade and, of course, for our trade relations, because the EU is on one hand a global trading partner and a rule setter, representing almost 6 trillion euros of goods and services trade, and on the other, for us, it is the customs union partner for Türkiye for more than 25 years now. And discussing the trade policies of the main trading actors like the EU is also important and necessary, especially in today's conjuncture, where pandemic and Russia-Ukraine war, as the EU puts the twin shocks, continues to shake the foundations of global commodity prices and economic trade policies. Customs union is the backbone of our trade and economic relations with the EU, but beyond that, it is the core for our integration with the EU. It's a phase for the membership. In fact, the customs union and the single market are the core of the EU's own integration process as well. Therefore, we can say that the integration dynamics within the EU are quite similar to those between Türkiye and the EU. So the customs union is not just a bilateral trade liberalization arrangement. The continuous legislative alignment is the core and the most substantial aspect of customs union. It applies many areas from trade to IPR, from customs to competition and technical regulations. Accordingly, the EU's new trade and trade-related legislation that we discuss in different sessions of today's panel not only have the potential of affecting the actual trade between Türkiye and the EU, but they are also becoming the new pieces of the EU's trade acquis that Türkiye needs to align with. This is our agreement with the EU. In other words, as a candidate country and customs union partner, we need to work with the EU for preventing this new legislation from harming the free circulation of goods under the customs union, and also for harmonizing them in a timely and an efficient manner. And as can be seen from the issues chosen for today's discussion, the EU trade acquis is constantly evolving. And distinguished Madame Bartelt also mentioned some of the areas, and the main areas of this evolution in a way. The EU is renewing and adjusting its single market and enlarging policies to tackle with the new challenges of today's era. To this end, EU is taking huge initiatives, and these are in the bracket of green and digital transformation. Parallel to these efforts, EU is evolving and deepening its acquis, and with new alliances, developing new instruments and new mechanisms. And we believe that a closer engagement with my country, between EU and Türkiye, is very important. On our side, we are committed to integrate ourselves to EU relevant policies and to remain a strategic partner in EU's road to dual transformation, because the #1 trade partner of Türkiye is EU. However, in case of we cannot integrate Türkiye to deepening and further equipped single market, diverging legislations might erode harmony between us, and our trade might suffer as well. And this is why we need close cooperation, collaboration on the areas that Madame Bartelt mentioned, and Ambassador Costa also made very, to the point comments. And as we know that both the objective of twin transformation, the EU is pursuing, and twin shocks of the EU, and we are facing all these shocks, and we are having in our economy the reflections of these issues. And in that sense, I would concentrate on carbon border adjustment mechanism, because this mechanism will be the litmus test for us for the cooperation between Turkey and EU, because it is an outstanding piece of the EU's new legislation introduced under the Green Deal. And when I read reports prepared by think tanks, by some comments, the CBAM will also determine whether there is an unilateralization, or there will be some autonomous move, or there will be some enforcement. And there is a thin line. It's like ice skating. There is a thin line between autonomy and self-isolation as well, because CBAM, if it is not guided in the right way, we can see that all the partners will have some self-isolation. And this is very dangerous for the multilateral economic and trade structure of the globe. We are all witnessing these unprecedented crises. And then in such an environment, it's more important than ever to have this cooperation. I mean, I believe that unilateralization is not the option for us. And considering the close partnership between Türkiye and EU, we believe that all members of the international community should play their part to combat climate change, taking into account the historical responsibilities for greenhouse gases. But Ambassador Costa also mentioned, there are so many gray areas, so many blurred areas in these regulations. And as a country which ratified the Paris Agreement, we officially published our own comprehensive roadmap to support green transformation in Türkiye. And we have our Green Deal action plan, and we would like to harmonize it with the EU, but we should see a good cooperation, consultation, exchange of views in order to do so. Because if we can isolate each other from, these standards, it doesn't matter being in Brazil or Türkiye or Brussels, we will all suffer. And we should be there. There shouldn't be any, moves, self-isolating moves, which will be endangering the future generations. And we are also following, of course, as both Madame Bartelt and Costa, Ambassador Costa mentioned, in the scope of Green Deal, regulation on the deforestation, free products, as well as due diligence requirements on the value chains, in order to prepare corresponding Turkish legislations in line with our customs union commitments. You know, there are some trends. Before, offshoring was a trend, and there were productions in the shores far from own territories. Then because of COVID, and now because of war, what we see is nearshoring, and also this nearshoring became reshoring, and now we see that friendshoring. You know, Yellen mentioned that friendshoring means not only being friend as you know, close cooperation, but to have the same legislations, to have the same understanding on deforestation, on CBAM. And if we would like to have friendshoring arrangements, we need to work on together to have efficient consultation mechanisms, both on the Green Deal and all kind of transformation. And the vital point for the CBAM is to ensure its application as a climate measure rather than a trade barrier. And this is the dimension we should concentrate on. And we should have a common domain there. And then we should prevent it to be perceived and to be arranged like a trade barrier. Within this understanding, our aim is to ensure a proper functioning of the CBAM in line with the World Trade Organization rules. This is very important. We should also not ignore WTO and any other mechanisms which are also acting like an alternative to litigation process of WTO might endanger the trade regime, preferential trade regime, and then we are mainly sensitive about preferential trade regime on coal and steel products, because this is also an important aspect of Türkiye-EU relations. In this regard, we expect from the EU to timely improve the dialogue, to have more dialogue with the partners, and we are having some, you know, consultations, and we are having meetings with the EU. I'm always on the constructive side of all these issues, and meaningful cooperation between Türkiye and the EU in the special basis of customs union, between Brazil and the EU, between Brazil and Türkiye. These are very important things, as this is bringing us to the solutions to tackle the climate change and environmental changes that can only be tackled through openness, global engagement, and cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Bozay, for these interesting reflections, which partly align and partly differ with those of your colleague Costa. Then as the fourth and final speaker, we have MEP Chahim, who is perfectly placed to inform us about the European Parliament's positions in these legislative processes that are ongoing on these instruments, and I think on CBAM in particular. So, Mr. Chahim, where does the European Parliament aim to make a difference in these files? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor De Ville. Thank you, Madam Bartelt and Ambassadors Bozay and Costa. I think it's very good to interact with each other when it comes to these type of very important legislations that will affect all of us. Let me first state that, as Madam Bartelt stated clearly, we are in the middle of the co-legislators' discussion. So it's very early to state what the landing zone will be. But I want to be very honest. There is no piece of legislation that we make that should be seen as a hostile move towards any of our partners, wherever you are in the world. When it comes, for example, to CBAM, people tend to forget that this instrument will go hand in hand with removing free allowances from our own industry. So phasing in CBAM means phasing out the free allowances of the European industry. So if we're going to discuss on whether this is a fair unilateral approach, we should look at the whole picture. We want to decarbonize, that's the essence, I think, of the legislation, and we look first and foremost to our own producers. Second, yes, indeed, I think consumers and our voters more and more ask us in general that they want to understand how things are produced and what kind of human, social, environmental impact that the consumption of that product has. And consumers are becoming more and more vocal about this. At the end of the day, if we look at deforestation, it's not a way to bully Brazil. I love Brazil. And CBAM is not a measure against Turkey. Of course not, because I really believe in international trades and in the multilateral world we used to have. I'm saying we used to have because in the last decades, there are some geopolitical issues that I think we need to resolve. And the last thing I would like to see is a multipolar world. I love the multilateral world where we, under the right frameworks, discuss many issues and commonly try to solve them. But if we look at climate change, and if we look at, forestation could be a solution. Producing less CO2 is also a solution. There's a palette of legislations that we're working on. Under the European Green Deal, we are working, I think now on 30 or 32 pieces of legislation. On the Fit for 55, it's about 13 or 14. It's not one thing. We are looking first and foremost at what we need to do ourselves within the EU. But doesn't mean that we neglect that there is also production outside the world. And we would prefer to not have any CBAM measure. I stated very clearly, I would love to see the revenues of CBAM to be 0.0, which means that it's a useless instrument because other parts of the world apply the same measures as we did, or as we doing. And I also said that if we can use that money to combat international climate finance or help international climate finance, I would be very supportive of that measure. But we also know that we live in one planet. Today, I was talking to the ambassador of Pakistan, who was quite clear on what's happening or what's happened in his country on floods. And it's very complicated to point a finger and blame one specific country or region. It's a very complicated situation where we're in. The same, we saw also the report of scientists stating that we are heading way above 1.5 degrees, although we believe that it's still in sight, at least. Which means that in the next decade, we need to take measures that will not always be nice, but they are not taken because we want to unfairly treat our trade partners, wherever they are in the world. No, it's because we really believe that it's 5 to 12. We need to accelerate our ambition, and we need to cooperate and coordinate our work. I mean, let's take Brazil. Brazil is a beautiful country with a beautiful Amazon. It is not the only country that has the Amazon, but in South America, it's a very important, let's say, wood for us, all of us. It's almost, you could say, some people call it the lungs of the world. And of course, we have to coordinate and collaborate with the people in Brazil to make sure that this piece of heritage is preserved in a good way. And I fully trust that this is done by the Brazilian authorities. I have no reason to question that. But at the end of the day, our consumers are saying that if the products that we're consuming lead to deforestation, then we need to understand if this happens, and then we can make a choice whether we want to consume that product, yes or no. I mean, this is the line of reasoning that we have in the EU. We want to look further than our own borders and take our share of responsibility. And again, it's not to bully Turkey or Morocco or the United Kingdom or the Chinese or India or the Americans or the Brazilians. That's not the world we want to live in. But we are willing to open our economy, the second largest consumption market in the world, for producers, wherever they are, wherever they produce in the world. But more and more, we will ask questions and conditions on these products made. What's the carbon footprint? What does it create issues environmentally, yes or no? And I think it's fair in an open economy, in an open international trade market that we have, or relations that we have. I think it's fair to ask these questions. And as long as we don't distinguish between domestic producers and third country producers, I think then we're creating a level playing field. and it should be it's a fair piece of legislation. I think these are my first comments, Professor De Ville.
Thank you, Mr. Chahim, for a very clear and very succinct intervention. Now, Ms. Bartelt, I would like to go back to you first to give you the opportunity to respond to some of the things that have been said. Perhaps particularly what Ambassador Costa said about disagreeing with you not being willing to call these instruments unilateral. I was wondering if perhaps you could clarify how then we should understand the difference between an assertive or autonomous approach on the one hand versus a unilateral approach on the other hand. So what is precisely the difference between these two concepts?
Thank you. Yeah, happy to come back on the different comments made, and also thanks for this very interesting discussion after the intervention by also Honorable MEP Chahim. He already covered a lot of ground now, also that I can also underline, and what both ambassadors have also said, that in the end, of course, cooperation, international cooperation is key, dialogue, and also assistance measures to accompany this transition that we want to support also in partner countries with our measures. So that's the first thing. And as was said, it's not the way to bully third countries. So that is a key point, and we are paying from our perspective. I mean, I'm working for the Commissioner for International Partnerships. So from our perspective, we are very much looking at that when we are discussing that also internally within the Commission. You know, that we always bring in the perspective of third countries and say it's important to have this dialogue. We have the delegations on the ground. And we have our toolbox, what we can do also with our assistance measures. So this gives this comprehensive picture. That's my first point. And then the other thing is also that we are looking what is placed on our market, or what our EU producers are going to export. So there is a link to the EU's single market and what increasingly also our consumers want. So because they want to have a transparency, they want to know what they are consuming. And it's not about going to another country and look what they have on their market and teaching them about our standards there. So let's be clear about it. What we are targeting is the EU's single market and access to it in a certain extent, to a certain extent. Now, then we are not banning products. That also be clear. I already underlined that in my first intervention, and I also wanted to maybe comment on that why don't we just stick to illegal deforestation? Why are we including also legal deforestation? And here is we have the loss of biodiversity, climate change are increasing at a very rapid pace. As MEP Chahim was saying, it's the Amazon is the green lungs of the world. It's in a way, it's going towards more and more to global public goods. And these are global challenges that we are facing. So at the COP26, the world leaders, they were pledging to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. And it's therefore not enough to only tackle illegal deforestation when much of the agricultural expansion causing it is caused by legal deforestation according to the laws of the countries of the production. And we hope that actually our trade partners would rise to that challenge and to address that. So that was my other comment. And then on the question of unilateralism versus autonomous measures. So I think, and I also said this, that since we are targeting both products that are produced by EU producers meant to export, or products that are meant to be placed on our market, there is no discrimination. So we have been assessing that, and they are not in breach of WTO rules. So this is something we have to distinguish maybe a bit between, are we limiting ourselves to areas where there are already international standards and we don't go beyond international standards? Or are we talking about not infringing international standards, but choosing for ourselves to be standard setter and forerunner when it comes to these kind of global challenges? And we have chosen the latter, but this does not mean that we are unilateralist. We are perfectly in line with international commitments taken. So that's why, for me, this is the difference between autonomous and unilateralist measures. And maybe also a last comment on the comment that they have an extraterritorial effect. So, and this is also, of course, very interesting. And you have to know that I'm a lawyer on the basis. So I have passed many years in our legal service. And in preparation, I was checking a little bit the case law. And there was actually quite a famous case on the air traffic agreement, where the court ruled on extrajudicial application. And what the court said at that point was that the interpretation of secondary legislation of the EU is informed by the objective pursuit. So, and as I was saying at the very beginning, the objective here is in environmental. We have environmental protection, again, to address climate change, loss of biodiversity. So this is all coming under this environmental objective, which, by the way, is enshrined also in our primary law by the treaties, which applies across the board and has to be respected. So this is in our founding treaties. And so here, and then it says this case law goes to fulfill EU environmental objectives. The EU may, in principle, choose to permit a commercial activity that would here in this case be the placing of a product on the market only on condition that the operators comply with EU standards. So, and then I'm not sure, I agree there is a certain extraterritorial effect to that, but is it a real extraterritorial application, you know, without any link to our single market and our standards? Or are we rather in a very transaction specific sphere of regulatory intervention? So taking into account the circumstances abroad relating to the placing on the EU market. So this is my comment on the extrajudicial application, and for me that was the most difficult element actually in the preparation, and happy to discuss that further. Thank you.